A majority of Americans don't trust biomedical scientists. There's another statistic there about basically a 30-point drop in trust in both physicians and healthcare institutions like hospitals pre versus post COVID. And, that mistrust in medicine is not necessarily misplaced, because if you do things that are not trustworthy, the natural consequence of that is that the public is going to trust you less. And I think that's sad to say. That's unfortunately exactly what happened during COVID.
So we have special guest back on the show. Dr. Aaron Kheriaty is a fellow and a director of the Bioethics and American Democracy Program and the Ethics and Public Policy Center. He writes about his legal efforts to oppose coercive medical mandates and advocates for transparency from public health agencies on his Substack at aaronkheriaty.substack.com. His new book is titled Making the Cut, How to Heal Modern Medicine. There's the book. It's a great book. I started reading it last night. I couldn't put it down. I stayed up an extra hour or two than I should have, which is why I'm tired today, and I got to chew the nicotine gum for a little boost. But it is really a great a book. Everybody should read it. Please welcome back to the show, Dr. Aaron Kheriaty. How you doing, buddy?
I'm great, Jimmy. Thanks for having me, and thanks for the kind words regarding the book.
Oh, no sweat. I just wanted, let me just read a little bit. Let me go to page 10, because I have some things marked here. So you say, when our medical institutions are compromised by money, power, or other interests external to healing the sick, and when medical schools succumb to ideological fads, the risks to individuals and society cannot be overstated. If medicine itself is sick, we are all in trouble. Ignoring the illness only allows it to metastasize, and that is why I have written this book. Wow, so tell me about that. How is medicine itself sick, and what has it succumbed to?
Well, if you look at the purpose of medicine, which is healing the sick and trying to make us healthier, I think on any metric of overall health in the United States, we're not doing well. So we spend twice as much as any other developed nation on our healthcare, which would lead you to think we're going to get better outcomes than other developed nations. But we barely break the top 50. I think we're ranked 42 or something like that worldwide in terms of things like all-cause mortality and the chronic disease burden. So not all of that can be laid at the feet of medicine and doctors. I mean, there's problems with our food supply. There's other issues that many people that are trying to address the chronic disease epidemic are rightly drawing our attention to. But medicine, I would argue, and I argue in the book, is certainly part of the problem. The primary purpose of medicine, I would argue the sole purpose of medicine, is training people who use their knowledge and skills always and only for the purpose of health and healing. There are many other important issues in society that need to be addressed. And certainly as citizens, physicians can get involved in addressing problems from poverty to climate change to international relations. But as physicians, and in terms of their medical training and medical education and medical schools and residency training programs, those need to be focused on getting physicians the knowledge and skills they need and forming them with the virtues and the ethical orientation they need to take those privileges that they've been given and place them at the service of sick individuals. So our job as physicians is not to fix all the problems in society. We can help with that in our spare time. But as physicians, our job is to attend to the needs of the sick patient in front of us. People are vulnerable when they come to us for help, right? There's an inherent imbalance of power in the doctor-patient relationship because illness makes us vulnerable. If I'm doubled over in pain in the emergency room because I have acute appendicitis, and a doctor walks up who I've never met before and says, "Hello, my name is Dr. Kheriaty," or whoever, and I'm here to help you. How can I help you? We have to be able to trust that person. We have to be able to trust the medical establishment that trained and credentialed that physician who happens to be on call in the ER that day. If we're going to go under the knife and have them remove our inflamed appendix or whatever intervention it is that we need. And because we're not in a position in that moment to sort of stand on equal footing, of course, we're equal in dignity, we're equal in rights, but in that moment, we're not necessarily equal in terms of the power imbalance. We have to be able to trust medicine. And one of the biggest problems I see today, especially following the madness that we endured from the public health and medical establishments during COVID, is that people no longer trust doctors. And I cite some statistics in the introduction to the book to that effect.
In fact, here's one of the statistics, if I can just interject. A post-COVID Pew Research Center survey found that 71% of Americans doubt medical scientists will act in the best interests of the public. That's amazing. It's
alarming, isn't it? Yeah. I mean, this is a majority of Americans don't trust biomedical scientists. There's another statistic there about basically a 30-point drop in trust in both physicians and healthcare institutions like hospitals pre versus post COVID. And, that mistrust in medicine is not necessarily misplaced, because if you do things that are not trustworthy, the natural consequence of that is that the public is going to trust you less. And I think that's sad to say. That's unfortunately exactly what happened during COVID. The other issue that I try to draw attention to in the book is the takeover within medicine by an ideology that I call managerialism. And managerialism is the mistaken notion that through the accumulation of supposedly expert knowledge, everything in society can and should be controlled from the top down, including in healthcare institutions. And it matters, I think, very little whether that top-down managerialist control is coming from a bureaucrat in the government in charge of a single-payer healthcare system like they have in the United Kingdom or in Canada, or it's coming from a corporate conglomerate that's gobbling up all the local hospitals and all the local clinics and then dictating what physicians and nurses can and can't do from the top down. We do need some regulatory apparatus in medicine, clearly, and there's a place for regulation within medicine. But I think the pendulum has swung so far in the direction of overregulation that doctors and patients become widgets in this kind of industrialized machinery of medicine. I think patients sort of intuitively sense this, right? When you go to the clinic or you go to the hospital and you're processed through the system where a doctor is staring at a computer screen, checking boxes, asking a series of questions that have very little to do with your chief complaint, not looking at you face to face, not examining you, not listening to what you have to say about your ailment. And oftentimes those boxes that he's checking are being dictated by external forces, mostly outside of his control, to the point where the doctor becomes a kind of glorified data entry clerk. Hospitals are built on the people moving model of Disneyland. I call it turnstile medicine. If you think about how Disneyland works, the engineers at Disneyland have perfected the art of moving people through the theme park, through as many turnstiles, as many rides, as many food lines, as many bathroom breaks as possible during the course of a day. And the whole idea is efficient people moving. Hospitals are built on more or less the same model of efficient people moving. So you get in, you get processed in the same way that everyone else is processed who's getting the hip replacement or the appendectomy or whatever the procedure you go in for. And then you get pushed out the door, but very often you're not healed. You're not helped very much in the process. And if, God forbid, you have something like a complication, the hospital begins to resent you for not behaving like all the other widgets in the system, or for not behaving according to this principle of efficient people moving. And doctors hate working in this kind of system. Patients don't like being processed through this kind of system where they feel like their needs are not attended to in an individualized way. And so there's unhappiness, I think, on both ends of the spectrum, from the providers and the receivers of care. And so I argue, in the closing chapters of the book, that we need to move in the direction of decentralization, more localized control, more discretionary latitude for doctors to be able to tailor their treatment to the specific needs of the patient, rather than following a kind of cookie cutter, cookbook recipe, formulaic approach to medical care that doesn't work for everyone, because you're not a statistical average. You're an individual person with individual variation, with a unique human body that in some respects is similar to other human bodies, but in other respects is different, and it's your very own. Medicine has moved so far in the direction of sort of industrialized, homogenized care that it's yielding bad outcomes, as the statistics on chronic illness are showing. And in fact, you can argue about these statistics, but one statistic that I cite very early on in the book is overall life expectancy. It's really hard to game that number or to spin that number. And starting in 2014, life expectancy for Americans declined for the first time since the 1918 Spanish flu pandemic. So the first time in 100 years, Americans' lifespan is diminishing, actually. That's not a good sign for modern medicine. That's not an indicator that we're making progress.
So you talk about, that doctors have to check these boxes and follow these guidelines. And you talk about that, you say that medicine, like many other contemporary institutions since World War II, has succumbed to managerialism, the unfounded belief that everything can and should be deliberately engineered and managed from the top down by a cadre of supposed experts. And managerialism is destroying good medicine. And just to buttress your point about the guidelines, you say guidelines is, in fact, a euphemism designed to obscure their actual function. They control a physician's behavior by dictating payments and reimbursement for hitting certain metrics. And in 1990, the number of available guidelines was 70. By 2012, there were over 7,500 guidelines. In this metastic, managerialistic regime, the physician's clinical discretion goes out the window, sacrificed on the altar of unthinking checklists. If the case histories recounted in this book have conveyed nothing else, hopefully they at least convince the reader that every patient is sui generis, unrepeatably unique. One cannot practice good medicine with one-size-fit-all cookbook. So that's what you're talking about, and that's exactly how, it. And that's how people are. That's how people are practicing medicine these days.
Unfortunately, it is, and these guidelines are not actually guidelines. They're dictated care from outside of that doctor-patient relationship. Again, they're based on statistical averages, which might not fit particular individuals. And so, for example, during COVID, just to go back to that particularly dark period in American medicine, if you went to your physician and wanted to have a reasonable, sensible conversation about the COVID shot, and you felt like you were hitting a brick wall because your doctor just said, well, you got to take the shot, and you raise your hand and say, well, but I already recovered from COVID, so I took biology 101 in high school and learned about this thing called natural immunity, which means that my immunity to this virus now is every bit as good. In fact, it's probably superior to what I would get from the shot. Do I really need the shot? Or I'm a young person, and young, healthy people are not dying of this virus. Do I really need a shot that is utilizing a new technology that we haven't had a lot of experience with? And your doctor most likely didn't sit down, and maybe some of them did, but many of them did not sit down with you and engage in this entirely sensible, reasonable conversation about the risks and benefits of an entirely novel technology for an entirely novel virus, what they did is just sort of unthinkingly and blindly say, no, you got to get the shot, you got to get the shot, you got to get the shot. Why? Well, maybe they had absorbed the considerable propaganda and fear that had been built up around this particular product or this particular virus. But also, there's considerable evidence now that third-party payers, from Medicare to private insurance, were tying reimbursements to having a certain percentage of your practice be vaccinated. And this has been going on for a long time in pediatrics with the childhood vaccine schedule as well. So that's an external factor that has nothing to do with individualized care for that particular patient and that patient's needs. That has to do with an external bureaucrat dictating that everyone needs to get exactly the same thing. And if you don't do that as a physician, you're not going to get paid. So then the question is, how do physicians attempt to opt out of this kind of perverse system? Are there workarounds? Are there creative solutions that they could deploy to try to get out from under the oppressive thumb of this type of medicine that is not good for them, it's not good for their patients, and it's not good for health outcomes?
And well, before we get to a way that doctors can get out from it, I just want to, you talk about, you say that we are facing an epidemic of chronic illnesses, which almost appear to be by design.
Yeah.
And so here's your kind of evidence for that. You say in a Goldman Sachs biotech research report in 2018, investment analysts said the quiet part out loud when they asked openly, is curing patients a sustainable business model? They admitted that single treatment cures are bad for business in the long run because they deprive pharmaceutical companies of recurrent revenue. And it goes on, it says, while this proposition, curing disease, carries tremendous value for patients and society, it could represent a challenge for genome medicine developers looking for sustained cash flow.
Yeah.
So there
amazing,
it is, right?
Isn't it?
That's chilling, isn't it?
It really is. Let me just flesh that out with a couple of simple examples. So we have developed very few novel antibiotics in recent years. Big Pharma is not putting a lot of research and development into new antibiotics, which could be very useful for certain infectious diseases. Why is that? Well, if an antibiotic works well, you need to take it for a few days, at maximum, maybe for a week or two, and then you're done. And that is not sufficiently profitable for most pharmaceutical companies to want to invest in developing newer and better antibiotics. To get an antibiotic, you got to go to your physician. You got to convince them that, this is a bacterial infection and not just a virus. So something that an antibiotic could reasonably treat. You get a one-time prescription and then you're done. What pharmaceutical companies actually want is not to cure your pneumonia with a one-off prescription. What they want is to sort of manage the symptoms of a chronic illness that never goes away, so that you have to take their medication for the rest of your life, right? And I'll just use my own specialty of psychiatry as an example of that. So with antipsychotic drugs, we don't cure schizophrenia. At best, we manage some of the symptoms of schizophrenia. And I don't want to minimize the value of that, right? This is a terrible affliction. It's a debilitating mental illness. Anything we can do to reduce the symptoms is a good thing, right? But if we were to find a sort of one-time cure, maybe a genetic therapy that cured schizophrenia, a lot of pharmaceutical executives would be upset, because right now, if you get on their antipsychotic medication, you got to take it for the rest of your life. You're never really cured of the illness. And that's the kind of drug that pharmaceutical companies want to push. They want to push symptom management that is not necessarily curative. That's better than nothing. Again, I don't want to denigrate those interventions. And sometimes that's the best that we could do. But it also gets in the way of us trying to develop things that are better, which is preventive measures so that you don't get the illness in the first place, or curative measures that don't require that you're tethered to the healthcare system and to recurring, repeated refills of your medication for the rest of your life. Medicine's pretty good at helping people with acute illnesses, acute trauma. So if, God forbid, Jimmy, you were to get hit by a truck on your way home from work today, go to the nearest level 1 trauma center and have the ER docs and the trauma surgeons patch you back together. But then for the rest of your recovery, get out of the hospital as quickly as you can and try to stay away from doctors. Doctors are good at that acute treatment, acute appendicitis, you got an inflamed appendix, you got to get an emergency surgery to save your life. Fine, great. Brain bleed that's, threatening to, threatening to kill you. The neurosurgeon might have to go in there and drain it and so forth. But for chronic illnesses, for the obesity crisis, for type 2 diabetes, for Alzheimer's, for chronic mental illness, we're much less effective at dealing with those issues. And we tend to sort of put on blinders and think that symptom management with medications is the only or the best treatment approach, rather than looking at what is the underlying cause, how can we prevent these illnesses, what are some non-medication, non-pharmacological interventions that might be helpful in dealing with these problems. Ozempic alone is not going to cure our obesity crisis. I don't want to throw out the baby with the bathwater. If you're morbidly obese and you've tried many other things, yes, Ozempic might be helpful for you. Okay, so I'm not denigrating the GLP-1 quote unquote miracle drugs. They have their uses, but they also have their risks.
So Ozempic is turning people blind.
It's turning people blind. It's causing, in some cases, gastroparesis, which is basically your stomach becomes paralyzed and you can't move food through your system. And sometimes, unfortunately, that continues even after you discontinue the medication. It can become a permanent, very serious problem. So the risks and benefits of something like this need to be carefully weighed. And the idea that we could just sort of put this in the drinking water supply and somehow that's going to get us on top of this obesity crisis without fixing the food issues, without fixing the other environmental toxins and things that are contributing to this, I think is extremely short-sighted.
So, you talk about the, first of all, you talk about how physicians, because of the system that they have to work under, that you've been describing, all the guidelines and the external pressures, and that they take, you talk about how, well, first of all, you say that the primary job of healing is on the patient, right? And
yeah.
So talk about that a little.
Sure. So just a sound philosophy of medicine sees the physicians and the nurses and the medical technology as things that help the body do what it's not able to do on its own, but the body is still the primary agent of healing. I'll give you a couple of concrete examples of what I mean by that. A surgeon does not actually close a surgical wound. A surgeon adheres the tissues that have been cut during surgery, adheres them together such that the body itself can heal the surgical wound. Antibiotics don't actually rid the body of infections. Antibiotics merely lower the infectious load enough that the patient's own immune system can then take over and rid the body of infections. That's why if your immune system is too compromised by, let's say, advanced AIDS or by chemotherapy that destroys your bone marrow, you can give all the antibiotics in the world that you want, and you're not going to clear the patient's pneumonia because the immune system itself has to do the work in addition to the medication that we're giving the patient. So it's important to remember this because we have this notion that the body is just sort of like a complex machine made up of interchangeable parts. And the physician is like an auto mechanic that can just open up the hood and rearrange the parts and sometimes replace the parts and fix me when my body breaks down. I think that's not an adequate understanding of what physicians do. The body is not a passive, inert piece of machinery that the physician just tinkers with. The body is a living, dynamic whole, naturally oriented toward health and healing. And the physician's job is to remove obstacles that get in the way of that. But the patient himself has to also assume some degree of responsibility for healing, which is a liberating idea. It means I don't have to depend entirely on the healthcare system for everything that I need. Doctors are there to help me when there's certain things that I can't do on my own. But one of the themes in Making the Cut, one of the sort of central ideas that I try to circle back on frequently in the book, is empowering people, again, with knowledge, with maybe even some degree of training, to take responsibility for their own health and to loosen up the sort of monopolistic control that medicine has on healthcare interventions. Back in the 18th and 19th century in the United States, there were these very popular manuals, sometimes written by physicians, basically teaching, I mean, mostly mothers, the essentials of nursing and the basics of medical care. And 100, 200 years ago in this country, the average American citizen knew more, at least relative to the knowledge of medicine at the time, knew more about medicine than the average American does today and could do more. We have thousands of medications now FDA approved on the market. I would say a couple of dozen that are really useful, that are like perennial favorites. Many of them are safer than some medications that are available over the counter. We're learning more and more about Tylenol, which is actually a remarkably dangerous drug. You can kill yourself with a Tylenol overdose. You can melt your liver with overuse of Tylenol, and it appears that may create problems for the baby in pregnancy as well. As you know, as that issue is, I think, still controversial, but there's at least some evidence that it may be contributing to the autism epidemic. So, if we have Tylenol available over the counter, there are many other drugs that require a prescription that are actually safer than Tylenol. That could probably also be made available over the counter, and we could educate people on the basics of using these things judiciously, not overdoing it. And medications are one way to empower people to learn how to treat themselves. But of course, there's many other interventions that don't require medications that people can assume responsibility for. So I think a reframing of our whole philosophy of medicine, seeing medicine as not the primary agent of healing, but ancillary, but something that's there to help us when the body breaks down sufficiently that it can't do the work on its own. Medicine does carefully, minimizing harm, does the minimum necessary to get the body moving in the right direction again, so that the patient can once again get back in the driver's seat of his own life and take responsibility for his or her own health. And I think we sort of need to reframe medicine in those terms, because we've been so dazzled by modern medical technology that patients, paradoxically in that system, patients feel sort of disempowered and like I have to go to the experts for absolutely everything. And if we learned anything during the COVID pandemic, it's that experts don't always have all of the answers. And, you have a certain level of expertise about your own body that I, as a physician, don't have, right? I may be able to learn things about your body and your health that you don't know because you don't have the medical training or what have you. But both of us have to collaborate together on the process of healing, because both of us bring something really important to the table when we're talking about your health.
So you made it. There's a statement in here from your colleague Harvey Risch has argued that evidence-based medicine, a term coined by Gordon Guillant in 1990, sounds plausible, but is really a sham. What does that mean?
Well, so it sounds good to say all of our medical interventions are going to be based on the best available evidence, but the best is typically defined as a double-blind, randomized, placebo-controlled trial. And that definition of what constitutes the best available evidence skews things in favor of expensive pharmaceuticals, because pharmaceutical companies are the only ones who have the resources to conduct that type of study on their products. So that tends to sideline older, very often time-tested generic drugs that can be repurposed for off-label uses, like ivermectin for COVID, for example. And it tends to sideline natural interventions that have not been subjected to double-blind, randomized, placebo-controlled trials, because no one's going to pay for that, but that still have considerable evidence in their favor. So rather than saying we should use the best available evidence and then defining the best as only the type of study that big pharma can afford to conduct, we should say medicine should be based on all available evidence, because there are many forms of good evidence outside of that particular type of trial that should inform our thinking and our medical care. So that's a clever sleight of hand that was introduced into mainstream medicine, I think, in the interests of those who stand to profit most by prioritizing certain types of interventions and sidelining other kinds of interventions.
So you also talk about the triumph of therapeutics. So you say the last several decades have seen the rise of what sociologist Philip Reif called the triumph of the therapeutic, non-medical issues from criminality and deviance to shyness or short stature come to be defined and often treated as medical problems. Could you speak about that, the triumph of the therapeutic?
Yeah, so this is the problem of what's often in the literature called medicalization. That's taking a normal variation in physiology or in psychology and pathologizing it. So short stature would be a good example of that. If you take a population and you plot out their height, what you get is a bell curve with most people, somewhere around the average height, and a few people on the tail end of the bell curve that are exceptionally tall and play in the NBA, or a few people that are exceptionally short. Now, there are certain pathological conditions that can impair your growth because they impair your bone growth or what have you. Those things that really are pathologies, sure, medicine can intervene and treat. But if you don't have a pathology, you just happen to be on the shorter end of the normally distributed bell curve. The idea that we should consider that a pathology and then give you growth hormone basically puts people, first of all, it subjects you to medical interventions that have potentially dangerous side effects. And it just moves the goalposts, right? Because if all the people who are on the short side start taking growth hormone, the average height just moves up. And there's always going to be people that are shorter. And so that you get into this cycle of sort of chasing your tail. This happens in psychiatry as well, where normal temperamental traits like shyness, which might be undervalued in a particular type of society like ours that's very driven and tends to value traits of extroverts, when that gets characterized as social anxiety that requires an SSRI prescription to sort of tune up your temperament, that's another example of taking something that's a normal human variation or a normal human trait and medicalizing it and pathologizing it, and then proposing that basically what you need is an expensive medical intervention to deal with this issue. While that may be very profitable, again, I'm sort of picking on pharmaceutical companies, but while that may be profitable for big pharma, it's not necessarily good for patients or society. We become less tolerant of normal human variation. And we also take on the identity of having pathologies that are actually not diseases or illnesses or mental health disorders. I don't think that's good for medicine, and I don't think it's good overall for our health.
So in the book, you talk about the medicalization of death. In fact, you say through the medicalization of death, healthcare has become a monolithic world religion. In its extreme form, natural death is now that point at which the human organism refuses any further input of treatment. So you even go on to talk about how you say you quote as Samuel Johnson remarked to James Boswell, when a man knows he is to be hanged in a fortnight, it concentrates his mind wonderfully. But medicine often inhibits this. It pulls the mirror away, as it were, when it offers either assisted suicide or therapeutic obstinacy. These conversations and the associated interior struggle to contend with life's terminus are shoved aside to search for the next medical intervention. Our attention shifts to an obsessive focus on lab values, vital signs, or ventilator settings. We defer to the self-perpetuating machinery of the ICU. Meanwhile, the patient declines inevitably toward death in spite of all this. Medicine thereby engages in a form of theft, really, stealing opportunities from vulnerable patients, opportunities that they will never get back. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah. So it's very important for medicine to accept its limitations. And death is the ultimate horizon against which we practice medicine. And I argue in the book that, contrary to some of the blank checks that overzealous geneticists and so-called transhumanists are writing, death will never be conquered by science and technology. And the effort to do that is not only futile, but I argue it will become dehumanizing. It will end up doing more harm than good. So medicine has to accept, if medicine sees death as the last enemy to be conquered at all costs, then Jimmy, it's going to lose in every case, because the human mortality rate continues to hold steady at 100%. In spite of all the wonderful advances of modern medicine, our patients are eventually going to die of something. I like to quip that life is a sexually transmitted condition that is invariably fatal. So what happens in modern medicine is, if you poll people today, most people would prefer to die at home, surrounded by family and loved ones. But in fact, most people today die in a hospital, many of them in an ICU, hooked up to all kinds of life-sustaining machinery that ultimately is not going to allow them to recover. And to me, that is a disservice to patients. And medicine, sometimes when you end up in the ICU, the medical machinery has a kind of momentum of its own. And we keep going for the sake of keeping going, not because it's actually going to help the patient recover. At a certain point, it becomes obvious to physicians that death is inevitable, and we're only prolonging the dying process unnecessarily. And so medicine has to have the humility to be able to step aside, first of all, to be honest with patients when cure becomes impossible, not to abandon them. We never abandon care, even when cure is impossible. We continue to provide comfort care, palliative care, but we inform them honestly that no, your cancer is incurable, and yes, we could put you on a ventilator, or we could put you on the dialysis machine, and that that might allow you to live in an unconscious state for a few hours or a few days longer, but it's not actually going to help you overall. So these kinds of difficult conversations would allow patients then to make the decision, no, I don't want to die hooked up to a bunch of machinery with tubes coming out of every orifice of my body. I want to go home and transition to hospice care or comfort care. And I argue in the book, the section you read mentions doctor-assisted suicide and euthanasia, which I think is another form of abandonment. And it's paradoxically, it's a form of denial, because it attempts to control the one thing in our life, which is death, that reminds us that we're not in complete control, that there are certain things that we have to accept, including our mortality. So I have a whole chapter in the book on death and dying and the relationship of medicine to death and dying. And I think it's important for medicine to try to extend life when we can, within reason and in ways that are helpful to patients. but also to recognize that it's an exercise in futility to try to completely conquer death and to allow patients to face their own mortality without giving them false hope or false reassurances that we can cure them when we can't. I think to allow them to do that is to practice a sensible and humane medicine. And there's some doctors that are very good at that, but I would say our healthcare system as a whole is not very good at that today, which is why we're not giving patients what they want, which is to die peacefully at home. We're subjecting most of them to unnecessary medical interventions at the end of life that don't at the end of the day help patients and only prolong the agony of the dying process.
Now, you talk about, all the undue influences on how medicine is actually practiced in the United States, and how it's all those guidelines we talked about, and
Yeah.
the result is that you say not only are trust levels tanking and diseases worsening, but the number of doctors also is dropping dramatically. Physicians are quitting in droves. According to the AMA, 1 in 5 doctors will leave medicine in the next 2 years, while 1 in 3 will reduce their hours. Wow. So
this is a very serious concern, right?
Yes.
Because who wants to practice medicine as an unthinking widget? That's not why you go into hundreds of thousands of dollars of medical school related debt and 4 years of medical school, 4 to 6 years of residency training, maybe additional training in a subspecialty after that, in order to be an unthinking robot, right?
Mhm.
So physicians are unhappy with this managerialist system. They know that it's not delivering good care. And so burnout becomes a serious problem. And it's interesting. There's been quite a bit of research on so-called burnout among physicians, doctors just getting fed up to the point where they leave medicine. Doctors work long hours. The work is sometimes stressful and difficult just by the nature of what you're doing. You're dealing with life and death. You're dealing with people under stress because they have cancer, and it's hard. It's hard work. But it turns out that the things that contribute to physician burnout are not long work hours or even the stress and strain of dealing with serious illnesses. The things that most contribute to burnout are doctors feeling like they're not allowed, because of the system that they're working within, to deliver the best care to the patients that they're capable of giving. So they experience what they call in this research literature moral injury. My conscience actually becomes burdened by the fact that I don't feel like I have the freedom to give patients what they actually need and what I know I could provide if I worked in a more sensible healthcare system. That, I think, is what's contributing to this problem of doctors leaving the profession. It's going to contribute to a physician shortage, right? If you think it's hard to get in to see a specialist now and you're waiting for months on end to see the doctor that you need, well, I'm sorry to report that problem may actually be exacerbated in the next few decades as more and more doctors retire early or leave medicine entirely to pursue other professions. So what can we do about that? Well,
you talk. Is this when you talked about you've started the Hippocratic Society? Is that what you're talking about?
Sure. So, I mean, the Hippocratic Society is one example of the kind of parallel medical institutions that we need to develop. And just very briefly, I'm one of 4 founding physicians of this new professional society for medical students. We're at a couple of dozen medical schools now. You can go to hipsoc.org to get more information on the Hippocratic Society. But the Hippocratic Society is about learning to practice good medicine. And our goal in the next 10 years is to have a Hippocratic Society chapter at every medical school in the country. And, this was started by doctors from Stanford and Duke and Harvard and myself, in large part because we saw a hole in the formation and education of physicians that needed to be filled. There's a huge need for other parallel medical institutions. I draw on a strange source to describe what I think needs to happen to fix medicine. And the source that I draw on in the later chapters is the dissidents in Czechoslovakia under Soviet communism in the 1970s. So, what do those people have to do with fixing modern medicine? Many people who have studied that period of history have heard of a guy named Václav Havel, who was a dissident became the first president of the Czech Republic after the fall of communism in 1989. He had another colleague named Václav Benda who wrote an essay arguing that in that society, which was, again, top-down control, in that case by the government, of all of the institutions of civil society, educational institutions, media and communication, medicine, healthcare, you name it. How do you get out from under the thumb of an oppressive regime like that? And this guy, Václav Benda, wrote an essay advocating for what he called the parallel polis, that we need to develop parallel institutions in all these areas, medicine, healthcare, communications, media, education. And in a society like that, if you try to break out of the system and do your own thing, the Leviathan, in that case, the state, or in our case, let's say mainstream medicine or public health, could target you for elimination. They could come and crush you, gobble you up, right? But if we start enough of those institutions, then the powers that be have to play whack-a-mole, right? They may be able to target and crush one or another of those initiatives, but they can't destroy them all because there are simply too many of them, and they don't have the resources for that. And that's exactly what these dissidents did under Soviet communism, to the point where eventually things like the Solidarity movement in Poland and the dissident movement in Czechoslovakia circled back and influenced the mainstream society sufficiently that the regime weakened and eventually fell, right? So I think we need something similar in medicine. We need new models of healthcare delivery, new models of payment and reimbursement, which do many things, including cut out a lot of the bureaucratic middle managers that are not contributing anything productive and are really costing a lot of money and getting in the way. And yes, if you try to break out of the system, you may be targeted for elimination. But if enough doctors and enough patients do that, eventually those things will start becoming the mainstream, so to speak. And this, again, is not a proposal that throws the baby out with the bathwater. We make use of the institutions of mainstream medicine wherever they're useful. We don't reject them entirely. We draw on them for the things that they're good at. And then we do other things to supplement for the things that medicine is not good at. And I think with the so-called MAHA movement, we're beginning to see these kinds of new experiments and new initiatives grow. And I don't claim to have all the answers to what needs to be done in that regard, except to say that it's going to involve decentralization and freeing up physicians and patients to once again take responsibility for their own healthcare. Some of those experiments will work. Some of them will fail. The ones that work will grow and develop. The ones that fail will get sidelined. But I think that's the general thrust of the kind of movement that we need in medicine. I think right now we're sort of on the leading edge of that. There's a supply and demand push for it because patients want something different. Many doctors want to try to provide something different. And some of these initiatives are starting to spring up here and there. I mentioned a few examples of them in the closing chapter of the book. The so-called direct primary care model being one example of trying to take what's sometimes called concierge medicine and make it accessible and affordable to the masses. And I think there's some models of direct primary care that cut out the insurance company middleman, that make healthcare delivery affordable and feasible for more patients, while at the same time reducing some of the overhead and some of the costs. So the book doesn't attempt to describe the solution to every single problem within medicine, but I think that general thrust away from managerialism toward localized, decentralized solutions that's where the money's at.
So, I mean, I really like the idea of your Hippocratic Society, because you are a medical ethicist, and You say what passes for medical ethics today often asks doctors to set aside clinical judgment in service to the expectations of third parties,
Yeah.
like insurance companies, or to patient autonomy arbitrarily defined. In contrast, Hippocratic Society physicians seek to discern and do what good medicine requires, thereby fulfilling our healing profession. So I really wish you the best of luck with that, and it's great to hear that you are expanding to medical schools because that's what I think needs to happen. But I just wanted to ask you, to me, the big problem in the United States, at least, is that we have medical insurance that companies that control access to
Yes.
treatments, and it's all based on money. And they take a third of the money that we spend on healthcare, and they put it right in their pocket while adding zero value to the medical treatment itself. No,
That's right.
they add no value, yet they suck up a third of our medical
Yeah.
dollars being spent.
Yeah.
And to the point where an average 55-year-old couple in California pays $38,000 a year in premiums, and then they get sick, and then they have to pay their copay on top of
Yeah.
it. I just had a $3,500 copay for my kidney stone,
Yeah.
and on top of the $25,000 a year I'm paying for my premium. And so if we got rid of so I always have advocated for a Medicare for all society. We should have our insurance pool start at the Atlantic, and it should end at Hawaii. That should be our insurance pool, everybody included, instead of the way they do it now. So go ahead, take it wherever you'd like on that.
Yeah. So I'm sympathetic to certain aspects of the Medicare for all proposal. I think we're a wealthy enough country that everyone should be covered. That is a laudable and worthy goal. And Medicare for all seems like the easiest way to achieve that. On the other hand, as a physician, in trying to deal with insurance companies and deal with Medicare is the one that you have no ability to negotiate with. Dealing with Medicare from a physician standpoint, if they deny coverage, is like dealing with a mafia. You're just not going to get anywhere. So I'm actually an advocate of trying some of the experimental models of reimbursement and payment that I described toward the end of the book. Again, not all of those experiments are going to turn out to be sustainable or workable. But one of the things that happens now, and it happens with Medicare just like it happens with the private insurance companies, is that you do get a bloated and mostly dysfunctional bureaucracy. If you take all the people in medicine now that have direct contact with patients, doctors, nurses, x-ray techs, some face-to-face encounter with the patient, the front office staff at a clinic, you add up those numbers, then you take all the people in healthcare that never encounter a patient face-to-face. They're just bean counters or paper pushers. The latter category of people who have no contact with patient currently outnumber the people who have some contact with patients. So hospitals develop these compliance offices that fight with Medicare about reimbursements. And the number of Medicare bureaucrats grows, and commensurately, the number of compliance officers at the hospitals trying to fight with and argue with and sort of, please those bureaucrats so the hospital can get paid grows. None of these tranches of people are contributing at all to patient care. So I would say I agree with you that every American should have healthcare coverage. Absolutely. I mean, I think that's a moral imperative. I think we need to do better in that regard. I'm not convinced that Medicare for all is the right way to do that, although probably some sort of government-sponsored safety net, maybe that's it, maybe it's something else, is a piece of that puzzle. At the same time, when you only have one game in town, you have monopolistic control, and you have a small number of people making decisions for everyone. And I do get concerned about placing an inordinate amount of power over these decisions in the hands of a few government bureaucrats at the Center for Medicare and Medicaid. So while I laud the goals of the Medicare for All proposal, I also worry that it could have some potential downsides. I don't necessarily have an alternative proposal that's going to beat it. So I mean, you can call me out for that hypocrisy. I don't claim also to be an expert in healthcare economics. I'm just speaking from my perspective as a physician trying to provide patient care from within this system. But yeah, I mean, the basic idea of that proposal, the basic moral thrust of that proposal, I think is correct, that everyone needs coverage. People shouldn't wake up in the morning worrying about going bankrupt because of medical bills. And we are a wealthy enough society that we can do that. On the other hand, if we allow bloated, dysfunctional bureaucracies to grow to undue proportions, and we waste a third of our healthcare dollars on things that don't actually help people, proposals like that start looking less sustainable. So whatever the solution is, it's going to have to involve some reduction of the size and scope of the bloated bureaucracy.
Yeah, I mean, I would accept your critique that Medicare for All has downsides, but nowhere near the amount of downsides that our current system provides right now. I was just in Australia, and everybody has what you had described as a safety net, a basic level of health care and guaranteed to them, and then they can buy insurance for things above that, right? And
I think that kind of hybrid system is probably the best way to get some of the best of both worlds.
Yeah, I would also agree with that. And that was what Tulsi Gabbard pushed when she was running for president in 2019, and I was okay with that. There's also a thing called Crowd Health. Now, they're a sponsor of this show. I don't know if they still do. But Crowd Health is works for the people. It seems it's a great it's another alternative. It also has some downsides, but it's certainly much better than the system we have today. And Crowd Health is just where people pay in very low premiums. And then if someone gets sick, they send out a note to everybody who's in their Crowd Health network. And they, instead of sending their payment to the Crowd Health offices, they send a payment to the person who needs the money.
Yeah.
It's kind of a genius idea.
Crowdsourced healthcare funding sounds sort of risky, but it seems to be working remarkably well. I mean, the people who sign on to this, and take what looks like a kind of risky proposition. What if people don't come through? What I'm hearing about, that's one. There's a couple of other models along those lines. That's precisely one of these kind of intriguing models. This parallel polis idea that I'm pushing. I think that crowd health is a perfect example of the kind of thing that we need to try, and see how it goes, and then tinker with, and maybe we develop a kind of hybrid system that utilizes multiple strategies to try to get coverage for everyone. But at the end of the day, we got to take care of people. And right now, the safety net is the emergency room. Yeah. Under this law called EMTALA, which requires that we stabilize people in the ER. But then when the ER becomes your primary care physician, that's terribly inefficient, terribly expensive, and places an undue burden on that particular medical specialty. So the safety net system we have right now is definitely not optimal.
It's horrible. I'd love to keep talking to you. I just want to also say thank you for your work during COVID, and I think it certainly contributed to people's lack of, now 70% of people don't trust the medical system to work in their favor and their best interests, and I think a lot of that came because of COVID. I'm sure you would agree with that, and I know you paid a personal price for it. It's funny, you were against mandates of the COVID vaccine as a medical ethicist. And so what did they do? They decided to fire the medical ethicist over his official opinion on medical ethicism. So that was just, so you paid the price. You stuck your chin out and you did the right thing. And so you're the perfect person to set up this organization to go and educate medical students on what it really means to be a physician. So
Thanks, Jimmy.
Again, just it's really a great book. I didn't think I would enjoy it as much as I'm enjoying it, and I couldn't stop reading it last night. Couldn't put it down, and I'm paying for the price for it today with my sleep. But Dr. Aaron Kheriaty, there's the book. It's called Making the Cut. It really it talks about how you became a doctor. How I love the quote in the book where you say, you're not a physician because you went to medical school. You went to medical school because you're a physician, which is such a great way to look at it.
Thanks.
And anyway, it's available at Amazon, and where all good books are sold. Making the Cut: How to Heal Modern Medicine by Dr. Aaron Kheriaty. I really appreciate you coming on. Thanks for writing the book, and hope to talk to you again soon.
Thanks, Jimmy. Appreciate it.
Okay. Come see me on tour January 11th in Waikiki, Hawaii, and January 30th in Los Angeles at the Comedy Store. Go to jimmydore.com for a link for tickets.